Good evening, everyone. Very exciting to bring you this special Evidence for Learning webinar tonight. We're running in dual states. We have John Cleary joining us from the Northern Territory. John, say hi.
Hey, good afternoon / evening. How are you?
Yes, good. How are you?
Yeah, really good.
What time is it in Darwin at the moment, John?
It's 4:30 p.m. in beautiful Darwin.
Oh, how lovely. We're at 6 p.m, a little bit less civilised in Melbourne, but great to be connecting with you here on our last webinar for the year. Now, we've got people joining us from all across Australia tonight. Everyone put into the chat box where you're joining us from. So tonight we're going to be really focusing in on the work that John has been leading since 2017 with schools in the Northern Territory, and now we've branched out to Victoria as well, which is really on the Northern Territory Learning Commission. And this is one of the projects that I've been incredibly fortunate to be involved with since 2017 in working with John. So I'll hand over to him now, and he will acknowledge the country that he is meeting on.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. This is really an exciting opportunity to share some of that work that we've done together and the work that began back in 2016. Hi, Lyndall. How are you? Alice Springs. So just to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today, the Larrakia people that I'm on, and also pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging also as well. And particularly emerging as we talk today about some of our students leading incredible work across our schools in the Northern Territory and really making a path for research and bringing it to life, as we talked about today, in their work in their schools and across their communities over the last number of years here in the Territory. So we're going to talk this afternoon about a couple of things. And the first thing we're going to do is just outline the work of Evidence for Learning. So Tanya's going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to share then the work of the Northern Territory Learning Commission itself, which is now 16 schools, as Tanya's talked about, a number of them here in the Territory, right the way from the east coast of Arnhem Land, right the way through to Darwin itself and down as far as Madaranka and south even of that within the Territory, spread across, I think, about just over 1.4 million square kilometres at this stage. And then schools also down in Victoria as well. So we'll talk about the Northern Territory Learning Commission and its work, the place of the impact evaluation cycle within that work, which is a really key piece of work for us and provides a structure around actually how our schools engage with research in a really intentional way across the work of the Commission. The place of evidence-informed decision-making for our students. So this is work that's led from students as young as year 3 in the Territory right the way up to our students in middle school, for students in special education schools here in the Territory also as well, through to large remote schools, small remote schools with about 13 students all the way through. So of the hundreds of students who are leading research in their schools currently, what is the place of evidence-informed decision-making for them as they make decisions about and support people in their schools to make decisions about how their learning might be most powerfully sort of move forward. We'll share a little bit of work at Casuarina Street Primary School in Katherine, the beautiful town of Katherine, and their journey within the Learning Commission, and then have a bit of a chance to catch up on some questions as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. So at Evidence for Learning, we're really focused in on being an evidence intermediary. And in this, we play three key roles. The first being that we build evidence. So this is through our Learning Impact Fund, where we pair a program of promise with an independent evaluator. And this is work that's led by Dr. Pauline Ho, who's with us tonight on the chat box as well. So far, we've had 3 randomised controlled trials completed, and we're just about to publish Resilient Families very soon as well. We also share knowledge. This is with the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. This fits into the work that we have been doing with John and the schools up in the Northern Territory and Victoria as well, in them using that as a source of evidence in order to make evidence-informed decisions at that school level. We also have our Early Education Toolkit that was released a few months ago as well, and our Australasian research summaries, which are published by, in conjunction and collaboration with our 2 academic partners, being Telethon Kids and also Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Now, a key part of our work, and really the focus of my role as well, is really to support use, because evidence is useful, but what is really exciting is that when we see evidence come to life, and that's probably why I've been so passionate about this project with the Northern Territory Learning Commission, was watching children take evidence and look at evidence from their school and then turn that into make decisions based on what the evidence is telling them, make changes, and then gather the impact and measure the impact that that's had. And that's been very exciting for me to watch, and is probably one of my favourite things to do. We'll be watching them pitch to the minister in little over a week. So it's very exciting.
Yeah.
So I've been fortunate. I've been fortunate to go to 160 events. And then we've got Susanna Schofield as well with us tonight in the chat box as well. And she heads up our work with the guidance reports. And we've got 2 published, one on teaching assistance, one on implementation, and then another coming out very soon on parental engagement, and then to be followed by metacognition. So that's our work generally in evidence for learning. And that's really the way we're trying to bring evidence to life through building, sharing, and encouraging use. This is a map of our partnerships across Australia. As you can see, they're quite varied, and we connect with every sector, independent, Catholic and government sectors across the breadth of Australia. Tonight, we will be focusing in on the Northern Territory Learning Commission. And at this point, I'll hand over to John and let him tell us more about everything to do with the Northern Territory Learning Commission. Handing over to you, John.
Thanks, Tanya. Well, yeah, probably picked up I'm not from the Northern Territory originally. You might have captured that as I was starting. So I came from, back in 2007, I moved from East London to East Arnhem, actually, which was a bit of a move at that point. So I was a leading literacy teacher in the London Borough of Redbridge, working across in London at that time for a number of years, and made the move across to an incredible place called Nooka, which is a community about 350 kilometres south east of Catherine itself. So they get about 700 kilometres south of Darwin, right out in the Gulf of Carpentaria. About 1,200 people, and the school was about 300 kids. And I remember walking into a year 5-6 class there as a teacher, thinking I was pretty good at what I did, lead literacy teacher from the London Borough of Redbridge. Here I go. And on my first day, I think I had 20 students who kind of came in to see this guy with an interesting accent. Then 15 on day 2, and then that gradually sort of went down again to the end of the week. I remember on the Friday of that first week, I started off with 15 kids in the morning, and 5 came back after recess, which hurt my feelings a little bit. And so I really had an opportunity then, which I hadn't had before, to sort of ask myself a question. And if I was brave enough to sort of say, well, actually, this could be, there's all things happening in the community for these students, or there's a number of reasons why this isn't me, and, I can't affect this. Or, if I was brave enough, there was real time feedback on offer on the effectiveness of my teaching. And my 3 years working in Nooka were really transformative for me, in the fact that I got feedback on my teaching regularly and often from my students. But actually what also was provided was when students were given the tools, the time and the space to actually provide the feedback to me around what it was that I was doing that really connected for them, the things that absolutely didn't, they were really able to do that, and often in half the words and with twice the impact. And so there was a kind of key mantra for me, Tanya, if you flick to the next part, which has sort of stuck with me from that time, which was that my students know more about their learning than I do. And I was, for my students in Nooka, I think I was the 13th teacher. So that year 5-6 class that had gone through school there, I was their 13th teacher across their life of school. And those students, if you flick to the next one, sort of really had a clear understanding of the things that worked for them and the things that absolutely didn't. And they could describe that. Again, if given the tools, the time, the space, and often the language to be able to describe that for me as a teacher. And so I sort of started to ask myself the question, if I'd left London, would I ever have known what active and passive disengagement looked like? And also, would my children in London have come back after recess if the fences weren't so high? And I'm not entirely convinced that they would. So it was a really incredibly formative experience for me, and some of the most challenging years of my time teaching, but by far the most rewarding. And so as a principal then, the kind of work for me in taking that mantra forward and thinking about this idea that my students know more about their learning than I do, and my kids absolutely did. What did that mean for me in terms of my work as a principal? So in stepping into Casuarina Street Primary School as principal in at the end of 2012, one of the sort of key things that we found pretty quickly, which really was, I suppose, a bit of a call to action but not just my own school, but right across the Catherine region. If you can flick to the next one for me, Tanya, was this stat, was that when we asked our students right across the 5 primary schools across the actual township of Catherine itself, and we asked them that question. We said, so my teacher talks to my parents about my learning, agree or disagree. And 46% of those students right across those schools said that they disagree or don't know, which sounded like a polite way to say no. And actually, when we looked at that, we said, well, we'll dive into this and try and understand a bit more what this actually means. And for those 46%, they said, no, my teachers talk to my parents. Yeah, absolutely. But about my behaviour, not about my learning. That doesn't happen. And so when we started to think, well, actually, what does that mean? Both for me as a principal of a school and across a number of schools. And we were really interested in the work of the Harris Federation back in the UK, which had sort of commenced their own work around the Learning Commission back in 2008, which really led to then the formation of what were really entitlements for students in their schools across the curriculum and for teachers and students themselves. I think it was 36 sites at that stage. And so we wanted to sort of take that a bit further in terms of saying, well, if our students have access to a range and a volume of information about their learning, first of all, how often do they access that information? And secondly, what about the people who are connected to them? What does that connection in terms of that access look like? And so the first 2 years of the Learning Commission, it was really interesting to see, if we can click again, that number of 46 dropped to 37% in the first 12 months, just through the involvement of students in actually having the conversation about what does actually great learning look like in our school? What does that look like for you as a learner? What does it look like for your teachers? What does it look like for our community? So even just the action of involving students in that first conversation was a really powerful one. And so I suppose to give you a bit of context, if I can sort of jump into, this is our, this video is from our year 3 students, I think, when I was principal at Casuarina Street Primary School in Catherine. So Catherine, again, is about 350 kilometres south of Darwin. It's a town of about 10,000 people, or just over 10,000 people, with a number of families who come from communities close to the township itself, a large number of students who are part of the defence community just outside of town in Tyndall, and a number of families who are working and living on remote stations who also come in then to be part of the community and travel to school each day, sometimes very long distances. So when we started the commission, it was about saying, well, the schools that initially came together, we wanted to design this work with the students in the town. This is my sort of 3rd year as principal at the school, and we really started to move, which is really exciting. But we actually wanted to sort of understand that it's going beyond voice, I suppose, not just asking students about how they felt about their learning or what that meant, beyond voice and beyond agency, which sometimes we have student agency put up as this, the idea that students taking control, but actually it was beyond that to partnership. So beyond voice and beyond agency to student partnership in their learning. To really understand, we're talking about 27 schools across 800,000 square kilometres, and across the territory 1.42 million square kilometres. When we involve students as partners in their learning, actually, what does that mean? What does that look like? And what is the potential for that work? When we legitimately say to students that the people who are most directly impacted by the decisions that schools make should therefore be involved in the decisions, and not only have the capacity to access a range of data to be able to sort of contribute to those conversations and really impact upon that, but often do so with a really significant moral imperative around, well, actually, this is my future and this is my work and this is my school. And for many of you, and John included, you might be here for a short period of time, but this is where I live. This is where I am. This is where I'm from and where I'll continue to be long after you might leave. And so therefore it's imperative that I'm involved in this conversation. You're not doing me a favor by involving me. This is this is my core business. So I might hand over to our student commissioners to explain a bit more about what the Learning Commission is about.
The Northern Territory Student Learning Commission is a group of teachers and students who strive to do their best
to make our school better.
It's a place where student voice drives learning and engagement in the Northern Territory.
to make sure the teachers listen to the kids.
So we can know what the students want, and so we can help them with their voice, so they can have more opportunities to do things.
That's your focus. That our teacher, so as commissioners, my teacher understands how I learn. Then what did you say after 1, 2, 3? We're going to increase feedback from us to our teachers about how I learn and how I evolve in my learning. Bang.
I think it's so important to have the Northern Territory Student Learning Commission because the student voice is very powerful.
It's the students learning that is the whole idea of going to school and going to class each day and being taught,
So it's important that they have a say.
and drive what engages us. One thing I would tell other students looking to be Student Learning Commissioner would be to make your voice heard,
And they should always be inspired about the work that they are doing.
be an example to them in your learning and the way that you achieve and are engaged. It makes me feel pretty proud and happy.
Hashtag
Student Voice Counts.
So just a few of our incredible learning commissioners. I think it's about 250 of our student commissioners across a number of schools now. But the really important piece of this work for me as well is that each of our 16 learning commission schools who are on this journey have a number of student commissioners who are identified in the school, but also teacher commissioners who play just as vital a role, and also principal commissioners. So across those sort of 3 key positions within the commission in the school, you have both the real lived experience of what it means to be part of that school community and to be a learner in that school, the people who are most incredibly placed to make the biggest difference in terms of the teachers responding to that feedback that they're seeing and driving the change, but the principal who's a key authorizer in actually taking, often we see sort of student voice packaged as working on the recycling project, and that's important, but actually how do we take kids and position them right in the heart of decisions about learning that are taking place in the school? And to do that, school leaders often make a significant difference in making that possible. So having all of those pieces working together, I think, is probably one of the biggest strengths of the commission. I guess so to take you through using the impact evaluation cycle, maybe just take you through what the year looks like. So this impact evaluation cycle, which is a really key part of Evidence for Learning's work, and which we found really exciting. So in 2017, I met Tanya and we got very excited about this work. We've been 2 years into our Learning Commission journey, and actually not just connecting into the impact evaluation cycle, but the broader research at the Evidence for Learning toolkits that really sort of synthesized and made accessible what otherwise could be this whole world of evidence, which teachers and principals found either very dense or too difficult to sort of access and penetrate. So the toolkit made that really come to life for them in terms of making decisions with their student commissioners. But the impact evaluation cycle itself, so the first thing that we do in that impetus and awareness stage for our commissioners is actually we provide our student commissioners with a whole range of longitudinal whole school improvement data. So we give them access to that data, and that's our progressive achievement testing in reading and mathematics, NAPLAN assessments, our A2E judgments, teacher judgments, student attendance, enrolment, and perception data for students and for teachers across the school over a period of time. So not just a once, but actually a number of years worth, so they can start to find and see trends in that. And we support our students to actually do that, to analyse that data and pick out some of those trends. And it's really interesting to see the way in which they have really empathetic and careful conversations about that. Of some of the concern raised when we first start doing this work is, first of all, should we be providing access to that data for students, and how would they respond to it? The answer is incredibly well. And I found across every single school that we've worked with, and again, like we say, that our kids are very careful and mature and empathetic around how they work with that data, but they also call out trends that they see, and they ask great questions, which are, so why is that going down when that one's going up? What does that look like? Why is there a gap there? Why haven't we seen the same movement here that we've seen in this area? Which sometimes we, certainly my experience as a principal, we can sometimes, sanitize some of our conversations to maybe not call out as clearly the trends that are presenting themselves in the data, particularly over time. So we provide that data to our students, and then they jump into the analysis piece, which is to say, well, that's all great, you found that trend there, but what does that mean for me and the learners at my school now? what's some of the information and some of that kind of small data, I suppose, that might go alongside this about the experience that will actually bring that trend to life and really explain what's happening. So our students conduct surveys, they conduct observations, the whole range of things, and we'll take you through an example of that today. But they do that analysis at the school so that what they have next the opportunity to do is to say, what can we adopt or adapt? So we've really by this point identified that there's potentially something here for us to actually investigate a bit more as a learning commission in our school. And the really exciting thing for me in the adopt and adapt stage is that of the 16 schools in the learning commission, most often what we see is that the challenges that present themselves to school, the expertise and the response to that challenge is actually already often available within those learning commission schools. There's a story or a journey that other schools can share and can really articulate the characteristics of how that change took place between those schools. And I think as an Australian educator, I get quite excited about the fact that the significant volume of expertise that is already here is probably the key piece of this work. And I very intentionally during this, the Learning Commission was keen to see people, rather than going to Finland or Singapore, I'd love to see them get on a bus and drive to Catherine, which happened, which is exciting, or get on a plane and come to Darwin or whatever it might be. But I really, truly believe that the expertise to respond to the challenges that we see nationally are already here. We just haven't captured or understood them yet. And certainly haven't scaled some of the success that's out there. So in the adopt or adapt stage for our schools, it's about seeing, okay, what's working and where and for why? Why is it working? Are there parts that might translate to us? And if we're going to make a decision about a change in practice, then the next piece is really crucial. When we make that decision and we act, then we need to evaluate and adjust accordingly. So across a period of time, it might be a very small tweak that they're making, but actually, how do we monitor and make sure that that's actually making a difference that we hope that it might? And at the end of that, our commission schools, very importantly, as Tanya talked about, they have a very, they have audiences right throughout the year. So at the adopt or adapt stage, when they've really sort of identified their kind of key thing they're working on, our schools come back together and they present not the finished product. They come back to say, hey, this is where we're at. And they provide genuine questions to the room and draw upon the expertise of those 250 plus student commissioners and others to actually go back to say, have you thought about this? Have you tried this? I wonder what that data looks like. How secure are you in your evidence? They ask all these great questions. But at the end of the year, our students pitch to the Minister for Education. So next Friday, they'll be going to Parliament House and they'll be pitching and sharing the outcomes of their research and the changes they've made in their school with an intention of actually, can this be system policy? Can this make a difference for every school in the Northern Territory? And we've already seen multiple occasions where that's been the case, where our students have pitched an outcome which then has become policy. And that's just really powerful. When we're positioning students in a place to be involved in systemic or school policy, I think that's a really powerful piece. And then, but also alongside that, there's the omit. Actually, we may have found that this journey didn't provide the outcomes that we were hoping for. And therefore, the question we need to ask is, what would it take to convince us that we were wrong? That maybe this didn't make the difference, and sometimes we need to turn things off and try again. And so that's as equally an important part of the work, I think, for our student commissioners. So the next piece for us is probably the most important question that we ask on the next slide, which is what is good evidence? I'll throw it to you, Tanya, to sort of dive into that a bit more deeply.
Great, thanks, John. So what we do with the student commissioners, we get them in that early impetus stage when they're looking at their data to categorise it as qualitative and quantitative. We run workshops with the principals and the teachers the day before this as well, so that we make sure that we're all on the same page. And so the students actually categorise the data that they have in front of them. Sometimes it's whole school survey data. Sometimes, as John was saying, it's PAT data, PAT R data, PAT M data. And they're looking at that data and they're categorizing it. And they're also saying, what is the quality of that data? So they're using the PAT blocks that we use in the Teaching and Learning Toolkit there. And they're saying, what rating of security can we give this? So the higher the number of padlocks, the higher the level of security. So they're sitting there and they split into two groups and analyze the same data sets and then come together and see if they can find a consensus. And most times they have been very similar in the ratings that they apply, which I've always found to be quite remarkable. And then they have to describe, why did you give it that security rating? So in asking that question, that's quite complex. And I've been constantly surprised actually in this project, as having come from a secondary teacher background, to see what these primary students and now secondary students can achieve. So we get them to really think about, and they ask questions of each other as well, which is, you know, what is the sample size that they're looking at? How does that compare to the actual cohort group? What percentage are we looking at? And they are really quite nuanced at looking at the data. They're asking that qualitative or quantitative question. And also they're asking the question, what is the survey instrument and has that been validated in a large population? The students themselves have come up with survey questions in some of the projects throughout the year. Others of them have used validated surveys as well. So it's been very interesting to see the discussions that come up between the students about the different survey instruments that they're using and then looking at that data. They're also looking and seeing, well, are there multiple questions that we can look at that are drawing the same picture here? Can we triangulate that data and say, well, really we have some evidence here rather than just data? So what types of evidence are really useful? And John's been talking about this, and he really walked through this in our impact evaluation cycle. And for me, there's really two key pieces of evidence that are crucial for educators across Australia. And the first being practice-based evidence. And that's that evidence where you look at and you see, are you having an impact? Are you having a difference at your school? And also, what is your data telling you at your school? What is your NAPLAN telling you? What is your PAT telling you? What is your reading results telling you? Just grades in the school as well. What is all that coming together to make a picture of? So I like that term, that's practice-based evidence, as coined by Bryce. And then we have the evidence of what works for whom and in what circumstances. We had Professor Steve Higgins on a couple of months ago, and he was talking about, and I like the language of best bets. So then what we do, the children have looked at the data and the teachers have looked at the data, the principals have looked at the data, they've determined a way forward, and then they go, well, what does the evidence of best bets tell us? What do we know, for example, about reading? And we know that in reading, for example, there's 3 different areas in the toolkit that you can draw from. That is the evidence of best bets. And then putting that best bet into practice in that setting. So then at the end of the project, as John was saying, the students present on the qualitative and quantitative evidence that they've gathered of the impact of the project that they've implemented during the year. And so the first question that they ask is the classic Hattie question, which is, has there been an improvement in students' learning? And the second is, what are those active ingredients in getting that working at that school? As John was saying, throughout Australia, there is some exceptional practice occurring. And if we could only really codify this and determine what is it specifically that is occurring in those settings, we can be able to scale this up and really help make, you know, good practice, common practice across Australian schools. And that to me is really exciting. So that's work from Professor Jonathan Sharples at the Education Endowment Foundation that's highlighted in our implementation guidance report in further detail. So in mixed methodology, so I've been fortunate to, in my role as an evaluator, working with Professor Brian Caldwell, always draw on both qualitative and quantitative sources, because we need to know the numbers and they give us one story, but then our qualitative data, it really gives us the how and those active ingredients of what has actually occurred on the ground. Now, I can talk about this for a long time. I love talking about it. I'm not going to take up any more of your time. John knows it, that's why he's laughing. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to hand over to some students and they're going to explain it to you probably much more eloquently than I could.
We headed over to the Michael Long Centre, where we learned about qualitative and quantitative data.
It's helped us to better understand how to gather and graph our data.
Quantitative is data with numbers and qualitative is data with words. We use the lock system to judge if our data is secure.
And there are year 5 and 6 students from Leanya Primary School there in Darwin.
Yeah, I think they deserve a clap. They deserve a clap.
Talking about quant and quant data. Great stuff.
Yeah, brings tears to my eyes. All right, so evidence-informed decision making. So what we're talking about in all of this is really is valuing that professional expertise that every educator brings to them. Every educator comes along with so much depth of experience. And we're not saying throw that away. We're saying bring that to the table and bring that and marry that with the evidence of best bets. So it's really integrating that professional expertise with the best external evidence to improve the quality of practice that's occurring within the classroom. So very much not prescribing what goes on from an unchallenged authority. It's really about looking and seeing what is the best evidence and giving that a shot in your setting and then measuring the impact of that. So here are the demographics of the schools that have been involved in both the Northern Territory Learning Commission and also the Victorian Learning Commission that was launched and went this year. So you can see that we've got a mixed range of schools, excitedly branching out into secondary schools because of the students requested. This is right, isn't it, John? We had students that had been through and loved the Learning Commission so much that they requested that their secondary schools join. So now we have secondary schools as well, which is quite exciting for me because I get to be a full teacher again in a secondary setting, or at least for a couple hours in Darwin. And we can see we've got a range of X-years, a range of the percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and a range of language background other than English. A lot of the work that we focus in on at Evidence for Learning is really trying to bridge that gap that we know that exists between students coming from backgrounds of disadvantage and those that aren't, and really helping to bridge that gap with evidence. So for this reason, we see this to be an excellent way for us to spend our time, because you can see a lot of the X-years there are really quite low in comparison to the mean of 1,000 in Australia. So this is from a publication that will be coming out, I think, relatively soon from the Australian College of Educators in the magazine Australian Educational Leader that myself, John and Helen Butler have authored. So whereabouts are those schools actually located across Australia? So here is a map that we can see where the schools are located. We have a zoom up in the Northern Territory. We can see they span quite a wide geography there. And what we're going to do now is we've been talking more broadly in broad brushstrokes about the overall Learning Commission, but we're going to focus in on the journey of one school in this, and that's Casuarina Street Primary School. And you can see it circled there in Catherine. So I'll hand back to John at this point.
So yeah, full disclosure, I was the principal at Casuarina Street Primary School between 2012 and 2018, the end of last year. So after about 11 years working and living right across the Catherine community and 3 little Catherine kids of my own. So being part of this journey, I guess I'll talk about, a 6 to 8 month period of research that the students led here. I'll show you through that as well, but to know that work sort of when it commenced in 2016 for these particular students is still ongoing, and they keep coming back to it and sort of building upon it throughout that story, to the point where the last piece I'll show you is from one of my last days in 2018, which I think was a really nice outcome of the students' work and effort. So we asked our students the question first of all, so what you're seeing here and what you'll see right the way through all these slides are, I think apart from 1 or 2 are my kids' slides. So no apologies for the fact that I'm going to be plagiarizing wonderful work from 10, 11-year-olds for the next 5 to 10 minutes. So this is what our students said when we asked them about what is good evidence. It's factual, it increases your opinion. There's also a substantial amount of it. The next thing they talked about then was that good evidence is proof of something or a topic that you're sharing, so a bit of proof there. And they also talked about this, which I thought was really important, that what is good evidence? Well, it's good evidence collected from student learning. and there's not always growth, and that's the reason teachers need to reflect on their evidence with all stuff there delivered with a velvet glove. And again, I'll talk about this, the idea of our students, deliver these really important messages, but in half the words and twice the impact. And you'll see when we have our positioning our students in delivering these messages, I think it becomes pretty irresistible for the educators that are involved in this work. It's been incredibly important. So what do they do first? So for our students, we'll see these data sets we talked about from the impetus. This was particularly looking at for these students back in 2016, they identified that there was absolutely an achievement trend in their PAT data and reading, but also through the school in our national assessments and in our A2E judgments, they could see a trend in reading, which was much less in terms of its growth and kind of sort of flatlining a little bit across that period compared to other areas in the school. And they asked that question, well, I wonder what that's about. And so the data set one, they sort of said they need more evidence. That wasn't enough. That quantitative data wasn't enough to actually be able to understand what was happening. So the next thing they did was they went and spoke to, we have students across the school called tracker students. So each class had a teacher identified 3 students who sort of was a really key focus in terms of our data conversations ongoing, and the students wanted to know, well, for those tracker students, what was the conversion on their targets, so the goals that had been set, and they found out that 96.2% of those students had achieved their reading targets. Oh, in 2016, hey, celebrate! And we're going, that's fantastic. And the kids went, well, but maybe your targets are too low. Which was, yeah, John, maybe your standards aren't high enough. Hey, and we're like, oh. Okay, let's dig into that. And when we asked those tracker students right across the school, and our students led those interviews, they had these key questions. Were the goals or targets too low? These are from my student commissioners. Were they challenging enough for students? Are we setting goals that were challenging for teachers? Did 96% of students were hitting those targets every year? Are we extending ourselves? And how does this fit with student PLPs, which are the student personalised learning plans? So these are the questions that our student commissioners put forward. But alongside that, our teacher commissioners had some questions too, that they were sort of starting to be challenged by. And they said, well, actually, do we have a set of guidelines that we use to outline structures and protocols around actually how those goals come to be? And we didn't. How do we use and analyze the data that's available to us? Is there consistency in that? How do we identify the needs of students and how they look like in practice? They're not just having a goal they might be working towards. What's a change of behaviour that would actually support students' progress towards that goal? Do we understand what that looks like? And the final one, which is really their key question, sort of their drop mic moment as teacher commissioners, they said, do we have a consistent approach to teaching reading at CSPS? I know the policy says we do, but actually what does it look like in practice? And so off our students went, and off our teacher commissioners went together, and they went to interview our teachers. And the first thing they found out on the next one, the students who interviewed our teachers found out that 93% of our teachers feel like their guided reading program could be improved to be more effective. And I love the little post-it note that kids stuck on there afterwards. Not sure which commissioner stuck that on, but they went, how could it be more effective? It's a nice question to ask, I thought. And the second thing they found out was this. That 79% of teachers in the school felt as though there was a need for more reading resources. So now we know that there's not necessarily consistency in policy. A number of our teachers are saying actually this could be stronger, and they're also saying there could be more resources provided into this area to increase the effectiveness of it. And our student commissioner response to this was, well, what are you going to do about it? And that goes for me as well. That wasn't just for our teachers, they're including that for me as the principal commissioner. And I like that post-it note there from one of our 11-year-old commissioners. If you feel something needs improvement, we'll take action. So that was a bit of a call for us. So the next piece that we did, jumping into data set 2. So our students from those interviews and some of those key elements they found there, they were happy with the fact that they had some evidence there, but again, there's good evidence here, but we have more questions. We have more questions. This isn't enough. 3, 2.5, or 1.5 there for the first one, because they weren't sure what was the sample size of teachers that were asked and under what conditions and how consistent that was. So the next thing they did was this. So they jumped then after this one into actually talking to the students, and they did some random sampling. You'd be very excited about that, Tanya, right across the school.
As soon as you say sampling.
So the students then asked a number of students across the school, do you have a personalised learning plan? And I thought, again, the students led this work, but again, they're bringing stuff back to us that we're getting more and more a picture now around actually what sits behind that trend that you first discovered in that in that whole school reading data over time. 13 students knew what it was, 11 didn't, and 1 thought it was their swimming note, which I thought was nice that the students had put forward. And again, this is all our student commissioner slides. But then they asked another question, which was this one, which was then, well, how engaged are your parents in that personalised learning planning process? Remember that first question that we asked, which is in terms of my teacher talks to my parents about my learning, and that continued to be a big focus for our student commissioners all the way through this work. And the key question they had about this was actually when we asked, because teachers asked this question during parent evening, could you flip to the next one for me? And they actually asked this question, well, what does engaged mean and how did they find that out? So again, we need to be more consistent around understanding defining what engagement in that target setting process would look like. And the last thing that they asked then was, well, when we look more broadly outside of our students who were tracker students, so actually, well, let's broaden this out more broadly. For students who were setting targets through those personalised learning plans, did they achieve their targets? And interestingly then, so we provided them with the data down to that level. We had some protocols around access to that, obviously, to ensure that was really clear for students, and teacher commissioners supported that work. But actually in crunching those numbers, then they were able to articulate very specifically where student achievement at targets was being most successfully seen and where it wasn't. And they drew a bit of a conclusion. So from all this work, they drew a conclusion, which was, first of all, if we flick to the last couple of data sets, they felt that data set 3, when they brought those pieces together, they felt quite confident about now they were starting to get a real picture of this, that they had numbers, they had opinions, and a huge amount of data evidence to be a 4.5. I like that. But the second one there, because there was lots of data, but we could still be more specific. So they were just starting to build this right the way through. And the last one they had was data set 4, which is the kids actually created what was called a confidence box, the CSPS confidence crew, and they created a system by which they could collect students' feeling of confidence in their reading over a period of time at the end of reading lessons. And they got very excited and designed this box, and had 2 groups, and one group went that way and one group went that way, and off they went. And they came back together after a period of time to find that they had very different outcomes of their particular trial. And actually the second piece there I thought was really important, where the kids reflected on, well, actually we need the same conditions around what we're doing here, because we didn't have the same conditions in the way in which we did this work, and therefore we can't really trust the evidence that we've got, because we collected it in very different ways and with different success because of that. So even their ability to reflect on how they were designing a particular opportunity for gathering more evidence, but then the validity of that evidence based on their collection methodology, I thought was really important when they look back on that. And so they came to this final point, which was after semester 2, they had a bit of a belief that they'd generated. And their belief was that confidence was key to growth in reading at the school. And their second question that they wanted to test was, what does confident growth in reading look like at CSPS? And so to do that, I think it was a really important step that they took. And with their teachers, they essentially designed an observation protocol and the process that they could follow for the second half of the year, which allowed them to do a couple of things. Firstly, they actually identified where we were seeing the most growth. The kids asked the question, well, okay, well, where is the most growth happening in our school currently? Where are those classes that we're seeing not necessarily the highest outcome, but the most value add in those progressive achievement testing scale scores over a 12 or 24-month period? And they identified those teachers, and they went and spent multiple opportunities to actually observe what was happening in those classes, and our students did that. But then they also did something else. They actually looked at what are the things that are happening in those classes that aren't happening anywhere else. So what are the things that are consistent to all classes, and what are the things that are only present in those classes? And our kids were able to describe those particular pieces, and that would be an hour in of itself. I think it would be a whole hour together. But our kids did that. We provided them with the language around it. And again, this is where your teacher commissioner and your principal commissioner are key, and why they're mutual partners. And the partnership in the learning here is sometimes our students found it hard to describe what it was that they were looking at, but they could describe it, but not necessarily in the language that teachers or others might access. And so actually you almost had this sort of pedagogical translation happening too between the other commission partners to make sense of what it was that our students were seeing most consistently in these classes. And what they did after that then, which I thought was, this is probably my favorite photograph of 2017, I think this was, where our students had spent that 12-month period getting to the point of yes, having a belief to test and a question to answer. But then they ran multiple, but this was one of the professional learning opportunities that the student commissioners led for teachers in the school to share what they found. Just to say, this is what we found in those classes. These are things that we most often observed in the classes that were seeing the highest growth in reading in our school over the last 12 to 24 months. And my school in Catherine had 430 students, I think we have in our school, and a number of the teaching staff that you'll see in that room are not from my school. They're actually from neighbouring schools, and some of the teachers in that room actually travelled, I think it was 250-kilometre round trips that afternoon to be in that room to hear and to be part of the professional learning those learning commissioners were leading, because their work had sort of spread across the region, which I think is just such a testament to the sort of power of student partnership and agency in this work. And when they presented this work, I think what probably my moment of the year is they identified the teachers and they named them, and they said, look, these are the 3 teachers that we worked with, and these are the things that we saw that they did that we didn't see anywhere else. And everybody clapped, and that sort of stuff happened. And at the end of this professional learning, the kids worked with then all the people in the room to sort of start to pull those pieces together, and over a number of different a number of months, and then we brought in some key expertise from outside the school to support our student commissioners and our teacher commissioners to do that work. And they designed a CSPS reading diamond that had these kind of core components. They based it on evidence. They had a consistent methodology, and over the next 2 years the school implemented and embedded that model to really build a consistent approach to teaching practice, which was really instigated by the students' work that they led. But at the end of this particular session, what I thought was just so lovely is that after they'd finished sharing that work, at the end of the session, everyone claps and the whole thing, and these 3 teachers stood up to kind of walk out of the room, and they were mobbed. They were just surrounded by people who were saying, do you have any time? I'd love to come and see you. Can you connect with me? I'd love to come and spend some time with you. And I thought to myself, I wonder if I'd given that presentation, whether those teachers would have been mobbed. And it was just a lovely reflection for the power of students to move practice forward when they are the ones who are standing up there saying, you know what, this is my learning, and this is what I've seen, and where it's most effective, this is what I've noticed. So we found significant power in that for impacting upon teachers' motivation and capacity to sort of move forward in their practice based on that feedback from students. And that's been part of our work this year with the team at Pivot as well, who've joined us as a partner in the Learning Commission. So the kind of last question, the last bit for me, which I thought was a lovely end to this story, was in 2018 then. So I had a very hot playground duty. It was like October, I think it was. So imagine me with my hat on, big orange vest, and it's about 38 degrees, and I'm on playground duty. And a student comes up to me with a post-it note and hands it to me and just walks off. And I think, as a principal on playground duty, you're like, oh, what's this going to say? And so slowly opened the post-it note to reveal this. And this is from one of our students in year 6, who not only on this post-it note has identified his starting scale score in reading, but his final scale score in his sort of second round of testing in term 4. He articulated his growth across that year, but he also knew how much he was supposed to grow by between year 5 and 6 for that scale score through our progressive achievement testing, and that equated to about 5 years growth in the last 12 months. So, drop mic and walk off. And he shared this because he wanted me to share that with the school at our muster when all the students come together, and to celebrate that. And I reflected that this had become more and more and more a regular occurrence. And I thought back to where we started from, and in terms of a measure of and a change in behaviour from the work the students have led. Again, over a number of years, they've been part of this work now. But to see the impact upon a student who now is able to articulate, and he was coming from behind that national mean to now, on par with it, for him to be able to articulate his growth in this way, I thought was just a really lovely reflection on the work that the students had led. So we see the power in the Learning Commission, and right across the territory, students doing very different things in their projects, from students this year who are designing multiple ways of providing feedback to teachers through certain approaches, to students who are looking at assessment task design, to students who are thinking about the way in which they build safety in their school and how they can measure and actually sort of describe what it means to feel safe and be safe in their school, to the students at Nooka who designed a project called the Mino Sabi project, which was the I Don't Understand project, which was a way for students to provide in-time feedback to their teachers when the language and the way in which they were delivering lessons was not actually meeting their needs. And they did that so that students wouldn't go home at recess time, which I thought was a really nice rounding of the circle for me, and something I wish that I'd had back in 2007, 2008, when I actually joined the community at Nooka as a teacher. And so hoping that teachers who might be joining now will be benefiting from that particular project that the Nooka Learning Commission students have led. So I might just hand back to Tanya then for our conclusion and any questions that we might have. But again, like, it's been a privilege to sort of be part of this journey, and we're really excited to see where our students will take this work. And again, as we position them as partners in their learning, the power of that partnership is becoming more and more evident in the difference it's making in their individual schools.
Thanks so much, John. I'm getting pretty excited about next Friday. Can't wait to hear wait to hear the final pitch. So this is just the conclusion that we've taken from our final article that you can read through. I'll read through it as well for all those that will listen back later on. So what the Learning Commission really aims to do, and it provides an opportunity for school leaders and teachers and students to co-design and really lead change projects. And John's walked you through one today at Casuarina Street Primary School that he was involved in leading. And really the ultimate goal of all of this is school improvement. So we know that rural and remote schools can face challenges, but what is nice about the Learning Commission is that it's engaging students in identifying processes of ways of navigating these while actually keeping a central focus in on the learning. And the most important part of all of this work, and John has emphasised this throughout tonight, which is really students as partners in learning, working alongside both the teachers and the leaders. And within this, we've structured it through our impact evaluation cycle and also our education action plan, which we haven't touched on tonight as well, which is a model that just provides you with a scaffold and questions under each one of the stages of the impact evaluation cycle. And the key bit is really that whole school data analysis at the start, the really in-depth impetus to determine really what is happening at that school level. And then the gathering of the practice-based evidence at the end to determine what has been the impact of that change. So external evidence has been integrated within this process, for example, through using the teaching and learning toolkit. Now we have time for any questions that have popped up during the session. So if you want to give us any questions in the chat, feel free, but it's also all right if you'd like to have a slightly early mark, since it is varying degrees of lateness on a Tuesday, quite substantially into term 4, which I remember the fatigue is quite well. I have educators in my house, so I can feel the fatigue coming off them. All right, well, we've got no questions at the moment. So what I'll do, I'll flick to the last slide and we might be able to have an early mark for you devoted people. So this is, if you feel free to join our Evidence-Informed Educator Network to learn about the webinar series that we'll be running next year as well. This is our last one for this year because we really don't think that December is a good time to engage with educators due to fatigue. Subscribe to our newsletter for updates. Follow us on Twitter, and we're on Facebook too. John and I are also on Twitter as well. And we've got both of our emails there for any comments and feedback on this session.